Welcome back. So in this lesson, we are going to create our very first Playwright project, and you'll be able to follow along and see what Playwright looks like in action. So if you want to follow along, first of all, I want you to open up IntelliJ, like I'm going to do here. I'm opening up IntelliJ for the first time, and it's going to ask me to either create a new project or open an existing one. I'm going to create a new project, and we're going to call it my first Playwright test. It doesn't matter so much what you call it. Make sure you choose Java, and we have Maven. I'm going to make sure I have the open JDK. It doesn't matter so much, but I'm going to untick this sample code because I don't want any of the standard sample code it's going to provide. We're going to do our own. So now let's create the project. And here we have a brand new Maven project. Let's make that a little bit bigger. And you can see in our source directory, we've just got some empty folders that we can use to put our classes. Now, the first thing we need to do is to add some dependencies to say that this is a Playwright project. So there are two dependencies that we need at a minimum. I'm going to add them here in the dependencies section. The first one is fairly obviously Playwright itself. So Playwright, the dependency is Microsoft Playwright. And the version at the time that I'm recording this video is 1.47.0, but you can pick whatever the latest version is when you're watching this video. The next dependency we need is a test framework. So we're going to need some sort of test framework basically to do our assertions and to run our tests. So I'm going to use JUnit 5, or as we call it in the dependencies, JUnit Jupyter, which comes from org JUnit Jupyter. The latest version at the time of this video is 5.11.1, but pick the latest and we can and we should be good to go. One last thing, Playwright is a test dependency, so technically this should have a scope of test. So we've got our two dependencies here, Playwright and Jupyter. Now all I need to do is refresh my project so that my project knows, IntelliJ knows about these dependencies, and I can do that by loading the Maven changes with this little icon here, clicking that, and that will load my dependencies. So that is the bare minimum you need to get started with Playwright. But I am going to add a third dependency because later on we are going to be using an assertion library to make some of the assertions more readable and easier to maintain. And this assertion library is called AssertJ. So I'm going to go ahead and add AssertJ, which comes from the org.assertj package. It will pick the latest version, 3.26.3 at the time, and I'm going to make this a scope test. Now, before we move on to creating our test, there is one thing I want to explain to you about this concept of test scope. What that means is that your libraries, these Playwright dependencies, will apply to your test cases. This is typically what we do when we have our main application and our test code in the same repository. For instance, here I have source test, I have all my tests here, and in source main, I would have some application code, maybe a Spring Boot microservice, maybe a web application of some kind. I would have the application in the same repository. And as long as you are testing that same code in the same repository, your application code goes in the main and your test code goes in source test Java. However, there is another scenario where you may want to have a Maven project, a Java project that is entirely dedicated to test automation. And you may even want to write reusable Playwright components that you can use in other tests. And in that context, we no longer want to have a scope test for Playwright. We would have a Playwright with no scope at all, which implies that it's a main. It will be able to go into the main package as well. And our JUnit and our assertions, they would still go in the test package. Putting Playwright in the main scope means that we can define Playwright components, page objects. In this particular case, having everything in source test is fine, but there may be cases where it makes sense to have them in the main component. Now, let's create our first test class. I'm going to put the test class in a package. So here I'm going to say new package, call it whatever you want, called Serenity Dojo Playwright. And I'm going to create a new test. And to do that, I want to create a new Java class. I'm going to call it a simple Playwright test. Make it a wee bit bigger. And now I'm going to create my test. Now, what are we going to test? We need something to test. Let me pull over a website. We are going to be testing this website called practicalsoftwaretesting.com. It's got lots of neat things that we can test, but for this particular test, all I want to check is that the title is contains practical software testing. I just want to show that we can go to a web page and check something about that website. So let's put this to one side and let's write our test. So the simplest of Playwright tests can look as simple as this. Void should show the page title. Always give your test meaningful names. And now we are going to set up our Playwright test. Now, Playwright works in several layers, and we'll look at these layers in great detail in some other modules in this course. But now, just follow along. The first thing we need to do is to create our Playwright environment. And this is called Playwright. And I can do that by typing Playwright create. And this will set up Playwright for us. The next thing we need to do is create the browser. So I'm going to create a browser here. And the way we create a browser is we take our Playwright object, we pick the browser we want. So Chromium, Firefox, WebKit are the usual ones. And then we launch the browser. And so now we will have a browser up and running. Now, in that browser, we need to create a page. Each browser can have many pages. So I'm going to create a page here simply by saying page equals browser, new page. And again, I want to import that page. So you can notice everything is coming from Microsoft Playwright, browser, page, and Playwright. So now we have our page ready to go. And we can go and open that URL. And the way we do that in Playwright is by using the navigate function. And I'm going to navigate to that URL, which will open the page to the right place. So once we have opened that page, we can go and check the title. So if we go and check it one more time to see what we're checking once more, we want to check that it says practice software testing. And to do that, I'm going to need to go and fetch the title. To fetch the title, let's simply say string page, string title equals page.title. And then I want to check that the title contains practice software testing. And I can do that with some assertions. We'll talk about assertions later on, but let's keep it really simple right now. And we want to assert that it is true that the title contains practice software testing. Now, finally, we're going to need to close down the browser so it doesn't consume resources. The way I do that is I can simply say browser close, and then I can shut down my Playwright instance as well. So let's run this test and see if it works. And we can see it executed correctly. Now, when you run the test, it might take a little bit more time the first time because it will download the browser binaries that it needs to run. But the second time, it should run quite quickly. So now you have got to the point where you have written your very first Playwright test. In the next video, we'll continue expanding on this test. We'll see how to locate more elements, interact with different elements, and to simplify the code a little bit.